Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this daily devotional. Today is Genesis chapter 19, verses 1 through 11. This is the beginning of a section where we're going to look at the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. This is episode number 35 of our study of the book of Genesis. We have covered a lot of things as we've gone through the book of Genesis. We've covered a lot of Abraham's life, and now we are seeing a continuation from his nephew, and that is in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. So let's get into this and study it and learn together here today. So it starts in this way. Now the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face toward the ground. So let's stop right there, and let's just look at a little bit of this story, and we'll keep continuing as we go. We're not going to get through all of this story today. There's too much to cover, so we're only going to get through the first 11 verses. But here's what we see. We see this scenario taking place, that there are two angels who came to Sodom in the evening. Now, the two visitors that departed from Abraham in Genesis chapter 18, so one chapter ago in verse 22, the two angels departed from him, from Abraham, as Abraham was still talking to the Lord. And it said that in chapter 18, verse 22, then the men turned away from there and went toward Sodom, but Abraham still stood before the Lord. Now, who was Abraham talking to? He was talking to Jesus himself, and he was talking to the angels. So Abraham was having a conversation with Jesus, and two angels accompanied him, and then the angels left and went to Sodom, while Jesus still was talking to Abraham. So the Lord and Abraham continued their conversation, and the angels now came to Sodom. Now, this is, by the way, the first time that they're really identified as angelic beings who had accompanied the Lord. They visited him, chapter 18, but it did not refer to them as angelic beings. But now we know that with the Lord, with Jesus himself, there were two angelic beings. Now they have gone on to go to Sodom, and they're going to encounter Lot. Now, we really have no reason to believe that Lot knew that these were angels that were there before him. To him, they probably seemed like very distinguished guests. Now, even though it says when Lot rose to meet them that he bowed himself with his face toward the ground, well, that would be a very common way that you would greet somebody who was really a distinguished guest, or who had an air of righteousness about them, an air of morality around them. That's how they would have met them. So there's no really reason to believe that Abraham knew that they were angels. They were just men of prominence. They were men of power, of righteousness and morality. They were different than everybody else, and that's why Lot first recognized and bowed down to them. Now, I want you to notice here that it says that Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. There's an interesting digression that happens with Lot over the course of his life. In fact, it says it in different places. Genesis chapter 13, verse 12, or verse 10, it says that he, and by the way, this is a steady progression of compromise that has happened in Lot's life. Lot continuously has compromised what it means to follow the Lord, and his compromising is going to cost him a tremendous amount later in his life. But in chapter 13, verse 10, it says of Lot that he was looking toward Sodom. And then it says in chapter 13, verse 12, it says he was pitching his tent toward Sodom. And then in chapter 14, verse 12, it says he was living in Sodom. So he went from looking toward Sodom to pitching his tent toward Sodom to actually living in Sodom, and then he would suffer the loss of everything when Sodom was attacked. Now, after they had been attacked, Abraham went and rescued Lot. Lot came right back to the place that he had left, and he was a civic leader. That's why it says that he was sitting in the gate of Sodom. Now, the gate area near an ancient city was sort of a town hall. It was the place where all the politicians met. It's where the important men of the city would judge disputes, and they would confer with one another, and then they would supervise those who entered and left the city. It was really the control mechanism of the city. So Lot had gone from looking towards Sodom, to pitching his tent towards Sodom, to living in Sodom, to losing everything for the sake of Sodom, to coming back to Sodom, and now being a civic leader in Sodom. He is compromised and compromised, and in that compromise, he has worked his way up in power and rank in that city. Now, Lot himself was a righteous man who was grieved by the sin that he saw all around him. 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 7 and 8, it says that God delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the world, of the wicked. For that righteous man dwelling among them tormented his righteous soul from day to day by seeing and hearing their lawless deeds. So 2 Peter refers to the fact that he was bothered by this, he was tormented by this, yet nevertheless, that's where he chose to set up his life, and that's where he chose to set up his influence. Now, there is an argument that can be made that that is what we are to do. We are living in a wicked world, and we are to be an influence in the world. However, with Lot, he was more being influenced by the world than he was actually influencing the world. And what we're going to notice is that that is going to cost him a tremendous amount, because his family and his loved ones, there's no indication that they were actually saved. His compromise, basically, though he wanted to remain righteous, it cost him his family. And I think that that's an important point in life, is that when you compromise, you may think, well, I'm strong enough, I can handle this. You know, I can, for example, I can drink and it doesn't bother me, and it's not an issue, you may say. But that compromise, where it may not be an issue for you, it may destroy your family down the road. You may compromise ethically in business. You may compromise your morals. You may say, you know, this really doesn't affect me. It's really okay. But it's not just you that it affects. It's a generational thing that is being affected by the compromises that you make in your life. Because of his deep compromise, very few of his family and none of his friends were going to be saved through what was going to come to Sodom and Gomorrah. The compromise destroyed Lot's testimony. Because he compromised, his testimony was damaged. And so be careful not to compromise your testimony, even though you may think, well, it doesn't affect me. I can handle this. It's not a big deal. That compromise will not just impact you, it will impact the people around you and family members around you. They may not be strong enough to stand up the way that you are, so don't compromise your testimony. Don't compromise your beliefs for the sake of freedom. Instead, think, how will this affect others? You know, I have the freedom to do this, but will it have an impact upon others in my life? So this is the importance of the story of Lot. So let's keep going on with what it says. So he said to these angels, he said to them, "Hear now, my lords, please turn into your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet." So he was practicing hospitality to people who he did not know, strangers that were among him, and he was entertaining angels, and he did not probably realize that he had been entertaining angels. But, you know, some of us have entertained angels through our hospitality and our kindness to strangers. So he does what is right. He says, "Here now, my lords, please turn into your servant's house, spend the night, and wash your feet, then you may rise early and go on your way." But they said, "No, we're not going to inconvenience you. We're going to spend the night in the open square." But Lot strongly insisted. Now, why did he strongly insist? I think because Lot knew the wickedness of and the perversion of that city. So he strongly insisted. So the angels agreed. They turned into him and they entered his house. Then Lot made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. And so he insisted. He was strong. He was, the hospitality that Lot offered. This is not unusual to visitors of the time, but the urgency with which he offered it was unusual, because Lot knew something about the community. He knew something about how wicked and how evil the community and the people had actually become, and how far fallen that they had become. There was a time that Lot should have made the decision to say, you know what, I cannot stay where I'm at because of the depravity and the wickedness that is here. Now, we are seeing that taking place across the world and across the country. We are having places in the country right now that they are wicked, they are depraved. There is all kinds of immorality, there's all kinds of impurity, there's all kinds of violence and rage and hard-heartedness and lawlessness. And there is a point in time that you say, you know what, I'm not to stay here and influence this culture because I'm not having an impact here. God has called me to go and move to a place where I can be safe and I can actually follow him with all of my heart. I can have a future impact there, but there's a time in life that you have to say, you know what, maybe I shouldn't be here any longer. Maybe I shouldn't be in this job any longer. Maybe I shouldn't be in this community any longer. Maybe it's time that I actually go. So he was urgent. He insisted, come and stay with me. He made them a feast. He baked them unleavened bread, and they ate. And so he practiced incredible hospitality in that area. Well, let's keep going. So now the wickedness is going to really begin. We're going to see the example of wickedness and the depravity of the men of Sodom. It says, now before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both old and young. So this is not just one group. This is the men of the city. This is the old men and the young men, because the young men have been taught by the old men what is perfectly acceptable. They had this practice that was going on. It was perfectly acceptable. And so they all came, both old and men, all the people from every quarter, and they surrounded the house. So they came to Lot's house. All the men of the city came to Lot's house, both the young and the old. And they said to Lot, where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out that we may know them carnally. So these citizens of Sodom clearly came to homosexually abuse and rape these two visitors. They were willing to break all principles of hospitality and morality for their own violent and sexual gratification. That's exactly what this idea of carnality is being said, what is being stated. We want to have them, we want to know them carnally. It was a physical abuse. It was a sexual abuse. It was a sexual gratification and violence, really, that is wrapped up in this. It was very just a wicked and depraved place, and they wanted to take advantage of this situation. And we read it was all of the men of the city. This was the entire city that was given over to violence and immorality, and that this behavior wasn't unusual. It was accepted among the men of Sodom. This is something that was accepted. And so this is what they had learned. This is what the culture had deemed was okay, and it was wicked in the eyes of God. In Ezekiel chapter 16, God later condemned and rebuked the great sin of Judah in the later days of the divided monarchy. He compared Jerusalem to the ancient city of Sodom, and he said that they were like sisters. In fact, in Ezekiel 16, verses 49 and 50, he says this. Then when God was comparing the sins of Sodom to the sins of Jerusalem, he said, look, this was the iniquity of your sister Sodom. She and her daughter had pride, fullness of food, and abundance of idleness. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy, and they were haughty and committed abomination before me. Therefore I took them away as I saw fit. And so the point of the Ezekiel passage was not to say that the only sins of Sodom that made them targets of judgment were the sins of pride, idleness, injustice to the poor, and such. Instead, they were saying that the sins of Sodom, also shared later by their sister Jerusalem, that it was the fact that God was grieved by this sexual violence and immorality. And this was considered a part of the list in Ezekiel that were covered under the words called abomination. God considered this abomination, and God was dealing with it. He's going to deal with the fact that this is an abominable act in front of him. This is a deprived and wicked act in front of him. There is no doubt that the Bible declares that homosexual conduct is sin. It's what it says in Romans chapter 1, verses 26 through 28. Now, people can argue, people can try to justify, people can kind of come up with ideas of their own, but the Bible is very clear that this is God's perspective and God's view on this idea and this practice. You can look at Romans chapter 12 or chapter 1 verses 26 through 28. You can look at Leviticus 18:22. You can look at Leviticus 20 verse 13. These are all this idea that God has a plan, an idea of what marriage is supposed to be, of what godliness is supposed to be, of what the human sexual relationship is supposed to be confined in the marriage relationship. And God puts this conduct, this homosexual conduct, in the same context as it describes incest and bestiality. In Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20, that's what it talks about. That's where it puts it in. So you can, again, argue and come up with different ideas, but this is God's view. This is God's specific idea when it comes to this. And this is what was going on in the time of Lot. Well, let's keep going. Lot is going to try to deal with this. He is going to bargain for the life and the safety of his guests. So they were at the door, and it says that Lot went out to them through the doorway. He shut the door behind him and said, "Please, my brethren, do not do so wickedly. See now, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man, two virgin daughters. Please let me bring them out to you, and you may do to them as you wish." This is incredibly disgusting. I'm sickened by what the mob was doing, and I am sickened by the way Lot dealt with this. But he says, I've got 2 daughters, and you can do to them as you wish. Only do nothing to these men, since this is the reason they have come under the shadow of my roof. Well, the mob said to him, "Stand back." Then they said, "This one came, this Lot, he came, he's not among us. He came to act as a judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." So they pressed hard against the man Lot and came near to break down the door. So this whole scene, this whole depraved scene is wicked. We have Lot who has compromised his faith, what faith he had, throughout the course of his life, and he ended up in this position because of compromise. And you may look at your own life and say, have you compromised, and what will that compromise eventually lead to? You keep compromising, it will eventually lead you to the point where great damage is actually done. So there's a point in time that you have to quit compromising and say, no, I'm standing in God's truth, and I will keep standing in God's truth. Lot had a completely different idea of what was wicked and what was not than the men of Sodom had. The men of Sodom thought they were pursuing pleasure, and they did not care that Lot thought that this was wicked. The difference in their standards points really to an important question. If we abandon the Bible's guide for sexual morality, what guide for sexual morality will we follow? To simply do as one pleases is not enough. It's not okay. It's not what is right. But that's what we have done. We have abandoned God's view of sexuality to say, I will do whatever I want. I will do whatever feels good to me. I will do whatever pleases me. Lot's offer to them, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Please take them. Let me bring them out to you. You could do as you wish. Just as shocking as the men of Sodom showed in demonstrating this depravity is it's just as shocking the way that Lot were willing to give up his daughters to this mob. Just incredibly shocking that he would really consider doing that. But it's even the thought of that this idea showed how little value women had in the pre-Christian world. Women had no rights, they had no esteem, they had no value as people, and Lot just demonstrated this, that his daughters really had no value if he was just willing to give them over to a mob to be gang raped over and over again. Again, just a very despicable and disgusting thing that he was willing to do. But it shows that he valued these guests more than he valued his own family. And he was willing to stand up for the guests more than he was willing to stand up for his own family. We can't back down in fear because of a mob mentality. And that's exactly what Lot was demonstrating. He was backing down in fear because of the mob. He was backing away because he was scared of what they would do. There will come a time where mobs will come against you, but you can't back down in fear and really compromise your values no matter what they threaten to do or actually do to you. There's a time in life that we have to stand up against the mob and say, no, I will stand for what is right, and I will not compromise, and I will not sacrifice my family, and I will stand up for God's truth. Well, this picture, this wicked picture, is going to ultimately give way to what we're going to see in the rest of this chapter that we're going to get into as we keep going in these devotionals. But let's look at one more slide. Let's look at two more verses, verses 10 and 11. But the men reached out their hands. They pulled Lot into the house with them and shut the door. So who were the men that reached the hands? This was the angelic protection that was at the door. They pulled him back into the house, and they shut the door, and they struck the men who were at the doorway of the house with blindness, both small and great, so that they became weary trying to find the door. So now there's an angelic intervention to this situation that is happening, this situation that is demonstrating the pure wickedness and the pure depravity and the pure evil of this community, yet God intervened. And that's just such an important thing to think through, is the fact that God intervenes. That when it seems the bleakest, when it seems the most hopeless, when it seems like the culture is going to tear you down, when it seems like the mob is coming against you, God can, and God often does at that moment, intervene. In this situation, the angels intervened by striking all of the men outside the door with blindness, that they could not find the door, they could not get in. They protected Lot, they pulled him back into the house, and they struck with blindness. Even though Lot had offered his daughters, even though Lot really had done what was wicked, as well as all of the mob at the door, God still protected. God, it's a wonderful picture of God's grace, that God's grace and God's mercy, God's power is still a protection in our lives, no matter what we are going through, no matter what we're facing, no matter what hardships come our way, no matter what mob is trying to break down the door, God is right there with you. So don't be afraid to stand up to the mob, because when you stand, you're not just standing in your own power, you are standing in the power of God. But don't stand for things that don't matter. Stand for God's truth. And when you stand for God's truth, God will be there with you every step of the way. His protection will go before you. His face will shine upon you. He will give you his favor and give you his grace as you fight the battles of this life. So don't be willing, or don't forget to stand up for God's truth. Don't compromise on what you know is right. Don't give in to the mob mentality. Don't compromise and thereby lead your way further and further and deeper into sin. Stand up for God's truth. Walk with him. Stand firmly in his ways, and he will protect you through everything that you go through. Well, come back here in a couple of days, and we'll pick it back up at Genesis, right there, verse 12 in this chapter of Genesis. And as we pick it up, we're going to see the conclusion of the ultimate events and end of the city of Sodom and Gomorrah. Thank you for joining me today, and I will see you back here very soon.